Hello everybody and welcome to our Friday presentation on the state of product design in 2022. Whether you're joining us live or remotely, I want to say welcome very much. It's great that we're having some live events again, and I'm very happy to be here talking with all of you and presenting some thoughts. And so just a general kind of agenda for today. I'll quickly introduce myself and our company, and then from there talk very quickly about how digital design has evolved throughout the years to where it is today, very briefly, and then talk about what kind of themes are prevalent in the industry today, as well as then modern tools, what we use in the industry, then a bit of hypothesizing about what the future may bring, and after that a conclusion and Q&A. And so if anyone has thoughts that they'd like to share or differing opinions, that is very welcome. Just raise your hand up or heckle, whichever works for you. And we also have comments on YouTube and Facebook, so feel free to message there if you want to chime in. So, what is Fractio? We're an IT consultancy. We're industry independent. We work on business critical web and mobile software. We work with our partners to help them go from idea to successful product, whether that involves design, development, training, or a combination of all of these factors. And so here's a few of the projects that I've worked on in recent years, from helping redesign online registration to gamifying education to helping create Finland's most popular digital signing service. And it's an image of me. Nowadays I really get a lot of my kicks from helping teams be empowered with design methodologies to really become more user-centric, and through this help reduce the amount of overhead and unnecessary work that people do. And I kind of describe my career trajectory in this type of thing, where I started as a young lad with creating things that I thought were really aesthetic and cool, and then kind of realizing like, okay, there's business interests, we have to try to keep those in mind, to then creating very elegant solutions that I thought were like really smart, but also aligned themselves with business needs and market realities. And then realizing like it doesn't matter how smart I think my solutions are, I need to actually involve the users to understand where the true challenges and value can be found. And now I'm here in the outlier field where I try to make myself irrelevant and really give those tools and techniques to teams so that they can do the design work without me. So how did we get here? Very quick run through. Is a little nice image from the early 20th century with the first design agency in the world in Germany. But truly, the need for digital design came from a very real place, in that machines used to have no real screens. It was all buttons pretty much, and they were called terminals. But the more complicated they became, well, we also had, I have this little remote control theory that we can always gauge where design is going in society by looking at what kind of remote controls we have. So we kind of had this back in the day when things were very simple, and it was nice. It was really nice. But then, things started becoming digital. Here we have Xerox PARC from the 70s, 80s. We all maybe have seen this, and where Apple and Windows really based a lot of their research on developing the graphical user interface. And, we tried to make buttons look like buttons, try to figure things out. It was very flat, which is kind of funny because now we're kind of like back there, but thankfully much more elegant. And then we kind of got further as graphics cards and computers became more powerful. We could create this kind of skeuomorphism, this kind of fake 3D pixel perfect type of look. And the remote controllers followed suit. They really tried to do all the things to the frustration of their users. And thankfully, with the advent of mobile phones and this rise of the customer experience, demands really went up. And we started to ask really fundamental questions rather than how it should look. Is this cool? Rather, we started asking questions like, what are we truly trying to achieve? And this started to guide us in a much more constructive direction. So if we think about Google, maybe it's famous for its zeal and laser-like focus to really focus on the user experience, to give people what they want. So unlike AltaVista of before, or Yahoo being a digital portal to all the things, rather it's more focused on what the user truly wants. And this has led to a big revolution in how we engage with digital services, what our expectations are. And it's really interesting to notice that even though this, for its time, was very minimal, it's only become more minimal the further we go, although now there's much more functionality with the advent of Google Lens and Voice Assist and all of these things. So we've kind of become more equipped, but also design has become more transparent. It's become more in the background and really trying to allow the user create and do what they want. And remote controllers have thankfully followed suit. And we kind of come to this age where now we're going beyond screens, where design is really embedding itself into the everyday fabric. We have smart homes, smart devices, we have interoperability. So you might not even have an interface on the device itself. So here's, for example, Reimago that we worked on for some time, which helped children be more active. Another example is Aura, where you just have the ring and the actual interface is then happening on your smart device. And it's cross-platform. It might be that you're on desktop planning a route that you then send to your mobile phone, and on your mobile phone you order an Uber. Like, all these things are working more and more together, and with the advent of Matter, for example, with the smart home, unifying all these different APIs and smart home protocols under one big roof, we might see a lot of advancements there in the coming years. But this is kind of like really where it's gotten to, and I would say that a big thank you goes to this man right here, Mr. Don Norman, by writing The Design of Everyday Things back in '83. I still think this is the most fundamental and important book for any designer to read. Again, it was written in '83. It was updated once in 2013 just to include a few more examples of smartphones. So the man was really a trendsetter. He basically single-handedly created human-centric design and UI UX as we know it. And of course, another big component of this is the advent of service design, which was, there's credit goes to many people, and it was there's the Service Design Network now, which is global. But basically, the big breakthrough was that instead of just looking at a timeline of what the user does, let's also think about what happens on the front stage, what the user interacts with, but also what happens in the backstage to enable that experience. So for the first time, we're really looking at things as a holistic approach. It's not just the screen, it's not just the outcome, but it's everything that is related to get that experience happening. And so there's no outside influence. Customer service, sales representatives, they all become a part of the equation, and we get to see a much bigger picture than what we were used to seeing before, and really combining the business aspects with the customer experience. And so what's going on nowadays? Well, people are on their phones more than ever before. This shouldn't be shocking. Over half of our time spent consuming media or using the internet happens on the mobile phone. Over 90% of this actually happens in our homes rather than on the move. And yeah, we're also using less apps than before. We're still downloading a lot, 204 billion app downloads in 2019. But the older you get, the less apps you're actually using on a daily basis. And most of our time is spent just using a dozen or so apps. And yeah, we only spend about 7.5% of our times in the browser, 92.5% are in native apps. So really difficult to break through into the market, even though use is more prevalent than ever before. So we have Facebook and its ecosystem of Instagram, and then we have TikTok and of course YouTube. And all of these are really kind of coalescing the market. So at the same time, businesses have a greater and greater need and desire to get on people's phones and to be part of their day-to-day lives. Oops. Apologies for that. And so how do we do this? The solution is we have to become even more dedicated to the user experience and become customer-centric. We have to talk to them, interact with them, do research so that we can truly understand where their challenges lie and what kind of opportunities we have to create value into their day-to-day lives. It's kind of like if 5 guys in a meeting room tried to decide next year's maternity package. Like, they're not going to succeed unless they get out of that room. And so I really like to say that everyone tests, but too many people test in production. So this is the reality that we just can't afford to spend $500,000 and half of a year to publish something that nobody even wants. So we really need to figure out what we're doing before we go and do it, ideally. And we've really noticed this even in our customer projects, that more and more there's an understanding of how important this is. And also as designers, I really enjoy that in the last years we've really talked more and more about the ethics and responsibilities we have as designers, because what we put out there in the world, like the most frightening thought is that the world is working exactly as it was intended to or designed to. And I think that there's something to be said about that perspective, to really think about what our responsibilities are in the services that we create, whether or not it's taking too much bandwidth or energy consumption, to whether or not it alienates those who are most vulnerable in our societies. And so we really have a duty to reach out and to try to see what the impact is of our services, and to think how we can make them accessible to all and not just those who look like us and live where we live. And again, responsibilities. Don't try to make your users into addicts. There was a huge theme going on for a long time, like read this book, and this hooked, like, if you read it, then take it as a manual as to what not to do, because I think it's just a very condescending way to go about living your life. So I know that the reason why a lot of these social media platforms are so successful and a lot of games are as addicting or hard to put down as they are today is that they have been worked on by some of the smartest minds to make them as unpredictable but rewarding as possible, because we are kind of like those chimps at the slot machine just pulling the lever when we're scrolling. And so I think that we should contribute less to the mindless scrolling and much more to helping people reduce the time and effort they need to use in our interfaces and services to get the outcome they want. And so how do we create world-class user experiences? Again, it's all about providing value. You might have the most beautiful social media network app, but if no one's there, what's the use? You might have a great food delivery system, but if the app is a pain to use, people are not going to use it to order food. To get to the point of like Uber, where you can open the app and press one button to get a ride that'll take you home, requires a lot of work, in that we have to understand what are the presets and defaults that we can use and put in front of a user that is actually speaking to them and their needs when they come to the app, rather than offering them every option. Because if I'm opening Uber, most likely I'm going alone, I want the car exactly where I am and I want it now, and I'm going to go home with it. And so we don't want to eradicate those options. We don't want to have an interface with just one big button, but with research and understanding, we can come to the insight that these things are very valuable defaults to have. And the same thing with Vault, that I can have my positive experience and then with a few clicks just order it again when I want to. So yeah, really it requires understanding your customer. And so the only people who can help you build a great product are the people that you want as customers. So, it seems obvious to me, and maybe many of you listening, but I think that it bears repeating that we really need to just get out of our bubble and talk to the people we want to serve, figure out what their lives are like, show them some things, get some feedback, and then decide how you're going to proceed. So ideally, what does this look like? It looks like iteration. So instead of having one straight line, we want to more think about researching, analyzing, ideating, prototyping, testing, and then implementing what works. So it's easy in theory, of course. It's always more difficult in practice, but I really recommend looking up Scrum and Agile and Lean. And I mean, we all know these things, but like ultimately to really be sold on the idea that we're not trying to create the ultimate solution that we then just ship and forget, but rather to create value, to become super successful, we have to talk about processes and operations, because that's ultimately what'll get you to the ideal place. And so in practice, this can be a lot of workshopping. I find that to be much more effective than meetings. Why spend 2 hours sharing opinions and walking away with nothing when you can spend 1 hour noting and voting and then creating action points and moving on quickly with decisive action? Because again, it's better to quickly try something and then see it didn't work than invest a lot of time and effort only to come to the same conclusion later. Yeah, so democratize the process, involve people who normally maybe aren't involved in the process, and see what they have to say. Because too many workshops ideating future product releases don't involve customer service agents, for example, who know all the tickets that have been submitted and what the faults are and where the pain points of their customers are, for example. And so again, even though a lot of these practices and methods were born out of the digital age, they're not exclusive to digital. And so Design Sprint, I think, is a really nice example of that, where if you go to sprintstories.com, there'll be a lot of stories of how local governance has been updating itself and becoming more agile using design sprints, or how a group of engineers used it to build a contactless elevator floor selector when COVID hit, or how architecture offices have made their whole design process more lean using these types of methods. And I mean, that's the great thing about design methods, is that they really are context independent. It's just a way of approaching any type of challenge. And our field has a lot of titles. I'm sure there's only more to come. And I think that, for me, for example, I started as a graphic designer doing some web work, and then just slowly building up my skills and getting comfortable with bigger and bigger challenges. And I think that the ultimate kind of like peak we can come to, at least currently, is called the product designer, which is very broad, but involves a lot of different types of themes. So here's just a few, from visual design to facilitation, front-end development, design ownership, business design. And I think that a lot of talk is centered around the visual design, UX, the code aspect. And I think that these are very important, of course. They're the fundamentals in many ways of what we do day to day. Like if you're doing UI UX design and you haven't even touched HTML, CSS, I think you're doing a big disservice to your team and yourself, because you'll be able to create much better solutions when you have some base knowledge of what it takes to actually achieve the things that you're concepting. And so I think that a bigger emphasis really needs to go into this soft skills, facilitation, surface design, design thinking, and user research, and of course as well, user experience design, interaction design, project management, design ownership, and business design. But I think that all of this is improved greatly when you focus on this, because it'll give you the tools and mindsets that'll help uncover new levels to these things. And it was actually very encouraging also that when I've been doing this survey for my master's thesis, the more experience they answer, the more they also emphasized the business and social aspects of bringing people together. And also in this survey, it was kind of almost unanimous opinion that to be a designer is to be a continual learner. And that's one thing that I really love about my job, because I'm basically paid to learn and to try things that I haven't tried before. And of course, the landscape keeps moving. It's like flying a helicopter. You move one thing, all the other dials change too. And it's a lot of fun as long as you approach it with the idea that it's continual. There is no end destination. And so it's all about the routines and the processes rather than achieving a certain milestone. And so one service designer with a lot of experience in the industry said that it's not just about design. You have to know how others work so that you can understand how to add more value, be curious about others' work, from engineers to purchasers to marketing to branding, etc. And I think that this really hits the nail on the head. We have to be curious. We have to try to figure out what is the root cause. Instead of just going with the first smart idea that we have in our mind when someone gives us a problem or a challenge to tackle, we should really try to question it and find what are the underlying themes and reasons for that problem. And so one of my designer colleagues said, a designer doesn't only design, they facilitate design thinking and advocate for the user. And I think this is a very healthy mindset to have, that it's not about you, it's not even really about your work, but it's about creating the best possible solution, and to be able to justify it, to be able to show with metrics and user interviews and research why you really believe in what you're doing. And so I think that one thing that's really just growing, especially with the pandemic, are these real-time collaborative online services that don't require you to install software or to go through a huge signing up process, but rather something that you can just send a quick link and then come to the same place and work in real time together. And I think this has been very healthy for our industry, and I think that for me this open design philosophy and culture that's sprung up has really turned a new leaf for myself, and I've been very glad that we're now in a world where design is not exclusive to a job title, but rather something that can involve everyone in the process. And so I think service design is something that has really grown in popularity and in emphasis. I see there's more and more service design programs coming out in universities. More and more people are intrigued in how these methods can help their businesses work better, because if you have a very hierarchical, old-fashioned organization, you can have all the knowledge in the world, but how do you really create change? And I think that service design offers a lot of tools for this. And so the basic 6 principles of it is, number 1, user involvement. Because if the highest paying person in the room is of one opinion, but you have research that shows 70-80% of people who you've tested think differently, you have a much stronger argument than they do, because ultimately they're not the customer is the customer. And so it's all about co-creation, and rather than being siloed off and trying to work in our own little huts, it's about involving everybody in the process, like I've been talking. And about this iteration, you're not trying to create everything at once, you're not trying to set it and forget it, but rather to have the most important stuff centered all the time, and in that way sequencing the work. You can't do everything, so what can we get done in the next 2 weeks, 4 weeks? And a holistic approach, kind of like the service blueprint, to really look, what is the big picture that this forms? What is the customer experience as a totality, rather than just looking, how does this button work, or how does the checkout email look like? And I think that one thing that's the newest addition is this authenticity. And I think this kind of goes back to that whole thing of don't try to make your users into addicts. Don't be demeaning. Try to really think like, what is the value? Who are we as a company? How do our values reflect and translate into the services that we provide? And these are very important questions that can really help transform cultures to become more proactive. So generally, we've talked about this in previous presentations as well, but I think it bears repeating that there's kind of like this shift, and I'm not talking about the rent economy or the quiet quitting or any of this stuff, but more that we're going from profits to purpose, that companies can't merely expect to get the best results by offering a paycheck. We really need to know, why are we doing what we're doing? What are we moving toward? Because without it, it's very hard to be effective. If someone says, in a year, you're going to have a sport event. See you in a year. Like, how are you going to prepare for it? Is it going to be a marathon? Is it a biking race? Like, what is it? You need to know where you're going in order to be prepared. So purpose really helps align teams. And so instead of trying to plan for every eventuality, it's more about anti-fragility. You're not trying to create a plan where you just go step by step, but rather you paint the place you're headed toward, you give them the tools and the support networks they need, and then you empower them to form their own groups and to get it done. So instead of control, it's empowerment. Instead of exhausting plans that take forever and no one really understands what you're doing, you do light experiments and you see where they take you. Because they're much faster, much less risk, and much less resources needed in order to make it happen. And again, also this move from secrecy to openness. And ultimately, like Don Norman said in his book, there is always a difference between what we imagine and what is. And I don't think that there's a more powerful way of approaching this gap than design. Because with design, we can uncover what we don't know, and we can create solutions and ideas that we haven't been able to imagine before. And this only happens by involving everyone who we can, who is part of the initiative. And so the Sinafin framework, this I think is really interesting. It's kind of like a workshop exercise. Here is just the titles. But as designers, if we think about the crazy terminals and the obscure kind of software that we had at the beginning of the digital revolution, we're really moving from chaotic to complex, from complex to complicated, and from complicated to obvious. Babies now try to swipe at TVs and newspapers because they live in a world where screens are interactive and multi-touch. And I think this is a great example of how far we can go with technology when we emphasize the human experience and really try to find what the core opportunities lie in different things. Like all the technologies before the iPhone existed, but no one put them together in the same way that Apple did. And so a few, 6 little tips how to concretely apply what I've been talking about these trends in the industry into your workplace. I think it all, remember the human. Just go and talk, interview with people, whether it's your colleagues, asking, what works, what kind of things frustrate you, what take too much time, what's confusing in our work, and figure out the trends from there. Or it might be your users. What takes too long when you use our service? What things frustrate you? What things have helped you? What makes you use our service on a daily basis? These things can really uncover things that you won't get just staring at analytics. And maybe workshops. Have a little experiment and see what kind of things come up with a note and vote. Maybe in that workshop you can visualize process, like how do our projects usually go? If we get a ticket and there's an issue, what kind of things happen? Because when you visualize it, you might notice like, okay, most things take only a few work days, but then we got this one, like for example, the review process, and that takes 2 weeks, and that's what's holding us down. And then you can focus on that and create new solutions for that. And again, you don't have to, create something that is complete and will forever stand the test of time. It can just be like, hey, what if next week, instead of having a meeting, everyone throws their topics onto the Slack thread, and then we'll take it from there. Or use Loom or something like this. Like, just be brave with it, because you can always go back to how things are now. And guerrilla user testing. Again, you don't have to put a massive budget and rent some research department in order to do some user testing. You can just pull random people off the street and say like, hey, you got a minute? And show them something and then get some feedback. It might not be relevant to your context, but even just a sign-up form on your current service asking people if they want to participate in a meeting talking about the service could be good. And again, scenario modeling. We have people, especially when you try to change things, they're always so scared. What could go wrong? So instead of saying like, don't worry about it or try to shut them up, go with it. Say like, okay, let's see. What sunny day scenario and horror scenario? What's the worst thing that could happen if we go down this path? Because that might actually also unveil some really good opportunities, and at the very least, they feel heard, and then maybe you'll have more sign-off on your crazy little light experiment. So we as designers and design methods for everyone are increasingly important to help uncover that which is hidden, to make the abstract concrete, to break down silos, and to identify the new opportunities that the markets have. And so we really need to focus on common processes so we don't keep reinventing the wheel. It's good, of course, that there's room to take things forward. Again, it's not about setting things in stone, but we really need to tighten the collaboration between the different departments so that we're not designing something that's completely different from what is coded. And when it's coded and in production, that all the issues with it are just going into some black hole and never to be discussed or seen by anyone else except the customer service agent who writes it down. And it's not just about the front-end experience. We can use design methods to figure out how to model the back-end or our database architectures. We can really help empower the entire team, not just people who do things related to visual aspects of the customer experience. And so I did a talk at Wolt. Time flies so fast. Was it this year or last year? But in any case, they had a Wolt design talk, and there Maria Lomakina, who's a motion designer there, talked about how they create documentation for micro interactions and animations to communicate with their developers. And so if you don't have basic documentation for even how buttons are used or data tables, how can we ever get to this level? So this is the fruit that these type of investments bear when they're in use. Like we can have new levels in our user experience when we have a more tightly knit group that we're working on things that produce results. Otherwise, we're just going to be scrambling and saying it's off by 5 pixels again for the rest of our lives, and nobody wants that. And so, yeah, we're really happy that we see that customers come to us and they're not only okay with a design discovery portion and some user research, sometimes they demand it. And I think that this has been like maybe one of the biggest changes in the last 10 years or so. And I think a part of that is because these design methods have really opened the door for them to be involved, that it's no longer about some designer in their nice hipster hat going off into a corner and coming out with this is what it should be. And there's a lot of business rationale for this. The International Electrical Engineers Consortium, I'm not sure what the third E is, but they made a very famous report some years back called Why Software Fails. and they showed that about 30 to 50% of development work could be avoided if we just had more iterations, more user-centric approaches to our work. And the cost of fixing errors after development can be up to 100x compared to getting it pre-production. So really, it just saves a lot of money, it reduces risk. Investors might be willing to wait until something evolves and that it creates value, but the B2C market is ruthless. If you come out with something and it doesn't work or it's a poor user experience, you're very likely not going to get a second opportunity for it. So it's just more and more important to save money by taking the time to do it right. And so another colleague, when I was talking about this theme, they talked about how design is increasingly holistic and involved. Before, it was the designer and their ego going into a dark room to work on something alone until it was done and ready to be presented. Now it's more about uniting and leading the team to discover and build the best solutions while keeping everyone informed and the big picture in focus. And the big picture can easily be lost. First of all, if we don't define it by doing like the service blueprint, and especially when you go into the weeds, the compass won't tell you about the mountains you're going to face when you start walking that way. So having an idea of where the value is, what truly matters, can really help make responsible and low-risk solutions when you're inside the sprint trying to get things done into production. And one thing that I really recommend looking into is design ops. It's gaining steam all the time. I think there's an event at the end of this month related to the state of design ops in 2022, which I thought was really nice. And so it's basically the idea of like creating explicit how we work, right? So how we work together, how we get work done, how our work creates impact. Very important categories for things. A lot of great resources in the Norman Nielsen group about different exercises and practical approaches you can take to just making it more apparent like how things are now. It's not even about changing things, but just seeing how does your organization function right now? I mean, if you don't have an organizational map, how can people get decisions done? Like if my project manager is occupied, who do I go to get sign off, right? These things can just add a lot of time. Like I remember reading about one construction company where they had to go, like someone at some point stole some gloves. And so then they made like this huge bureaucratic process that took a few weeks to sign off for like a €3 gloves. And so you had a lot of people who couldn't work because they didn't have gloves. So this little process to try to save a few euros in a year cost them tens of thousands of euros. And so sometimes there can be a justification for why a certain process exists, but it might not be having the effect that it was supposed to have. And so visualizing, making the implicit explicit can really help with that. And so when the NN Group did a huge research of 557 designers and UX practitioners, they found that only 22% of organizations did any type of recommended design op efforts or had design op dedicated roles or invested in maturing their design ops in general. So this is a really effective and easy way to help increase the quality of your design operations in your organization. So stop waiting, be the change. And it doesn't even need to be anything grand. You can just go to Miro.com, open an account, and do a little sailboat exercise or an icebreaker even with your colleagues. The only thing I really hope that you do is you decide what you want to achieve before you invite your colleagues. Set the stage, get the template, make sure everything is ready, and then invite the people. Unless it's like a designer and you're just like, hey, let's figure this out, let's try this. Like, go ahead, but like if you involve other people, respect their time, decide what you want to get done. So, let's talk a little bit about the tools we use today. What are we up to? Well, at least for now, darn you, Adobe, Figma for now is king. I give it 3 to 5 years at least. Like it's a healthy organization, but Adobe is a monster. So it might be already next year unusable. We don't know. I'm not looking forward to Figma CC 2023. I'll tell you that. But what does this mean? Well, if we look at a 2021 Design Tools Survey by the UX Tools community, we see that in 2017, Sketch was still riding high at over 70%, and around midway 2019, we crashed the threshold where Figma took over. And of course, there's a lot of people who work in agencies who are forced to work with Sketch, and so they're using Figma and Sketch. But we've had some clients come, because we offer Figma training, they come to us because they're like, we can't hire, we're unable to hire designers anymore because we work in Sketch. Please help us transition to Figma. And of course, gladly we do. For now. We'll see. A lot of different options are starting to look more nice. But so aside from this use going up, here they asked, like, okay, what are the popular tools for Mac and Windows? Figma 1-in-1. I mean, it's online, so you don't need to install anything to make it work. You just go to figma.com, log in with Google, and you're up and running in less than a minute. What software do you use for prototyping? Figma. What software do you use for managing design systems? Figma. Software for developer handoff? Figma. What tools are you most excited to try? Figma. So this is what I mean by Figma is king. Like, it's in a league of its own right now. Please, Adobe, don't break it. And so if we look at the summary of this survey, Figma rules in all categories except digital whiteboarding, but even there we have it as number 2 and 3, because they have FigJam, of course, nowadays, which is their whiteboarding solution, which is really nice. And so, what are some of the Figma strengths that I believe cause it to be up high and really sets it apart from the competition? Well, it enables real-time collaboration. This is something that still many of these design tools struggle with. Sketch is still kind of like halfway there because they're dependent on the file system. But in Figma, everything is on the cloud, so you have a single source of truth. What you're seeing is what exists currently. And it's simple to start using, but it also has a lot of advanced features like auto layout, which is kind of like the Flexbox of the UI world. And again, it's browser-based, so anyone can go and play with it, like even a mobile phone for the prototypes. It has really strong APIs, which gives it a rich plugin community, meaning that it's endlessly customizable, and they release really quickly. I don't feel like they're quite listening to their audiences as much as they did when they were smaller. Like, their roadmaps aren't public anymore, and they're a bit more And I know now it's like hopeless because they're with daddy now, but let's hope for the best. And so some of my favorite Figma add-ons I want to plug here, big list, everything from Jitter, which allows you to do motion graphics using Figma with a few clicks, to Bravo Studio, which allows you to build native apps with database functionality just using Figma and like Airtable, which is really cool. Pitch Deck Studio, we use that at Fructio to export stuff like sales slides and stuff into Google Slides or PowerPoint. Tiny image compressor for PDFs and just decreasing file sizes, really nice. A lot of stuff. I could go on endlessly about this, so let's move on. So what are the options once Adobe breaks Figma? I'm not going to stop piling on. I'm still very upset. This happened yesterday, but I'm a big Figma advocate, and now I don't know what to do with my life. But okay, we got Framer. This is kind of like Figma, but it allows you to go from user interface design to coded interface with the click of a button. It's very intriguing, very fascinating. I haven't had time to go into it because Figma is iterated, but Framer has gone through like 11 iterations of their service. They had Framer X, Framer Sites, and all this, but now it's just Framer. So it's very simple, also quick to log on. I'm a co-host on a podcast. We built our site with Framer. It's very intuitive, but of course it has a learning curve like everything else. And then we got Adobe's XD, which has some functionality that Figma doesn't have, such as triggering sound files, having prototyping like voice interactions. So there's definitely a place for it. And of course, if you don't want to host your files in the cloud and you want to have it locally, I would say Adobe XD is probably the best solution for that, personally. And then we have Sketch, which really started the revolution of interface design software. But I really wouldn't go for it anymore. It pains me every time I have to open it and work with it. Everything just feels more cumbersome. And they're still in the native Mac file, and they have the Sketch cloud, but it's not the same as Sketch. And it's just confusing. So, thank you for your service is what I have to say. And of course, like sometimes we want to build more complicated prototypes. Figma doesn't do everything. It has really nice animations and interactions from dragging and spring animations and whatnot. But ProtoPie, I'd say, is my go-to if I'm not building something directly into the web. Quickly give a shout out soon to Webflow. But ProtoPie is really nice because you can even build prototypes with many devices. And you can do voice things, you can have user input, use native keyboard, save values, retrieve them, use them in different contexts, use the camera on a mobile device. So it's really amazing the kind of stuff that it can do, but of course it requires then the learning curve, which is steeper than in Framer or Figma. But yeah, definitely the kind of prototypes and things you can ideate with that is really amazing, and of course much faster than actually doing it in production code. There was also Principle. Apparently it's still kicking around. It was in that design tool survey. This was like the OG super prototyping tool from back in the Sketch days. I used to use this, but I would say nowadays just go for ProtoPie. And okay, so Webflow. This is more of like an interface for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's part of the no-code movement, which kind of Framer also represents. The thing I really love about this is that it's really good at actually showing you what the end result will look like, and it has responsive or breakpoint support, and it has a really good animation engine, etc. So it's really powerful, really good, but I would say that this has an even higher learning curve because there's no freely putting things as you would want. You have to really kind of like define things in the HTML, CSS world, but they have a really good Webflow Academy that you can use to learn the software. And of course, with this no-code movement, we're seeing a lot of really interesting new players like Airtable coming out with the Interface Designer, which allows you to create all kinds of dashboards and survey forms and interactive things that you can throw at users, and they can actually use it like a real service, and then those results are saved into a database. So really fantastic, really lowers the threshold for people to be involved. And of course, using Airtable as well as Notion for databases because they have really good APIs, so you can plug them in, for example, into Bravo Studio to create a native app using Figma and then saving the user data in here. But Notion, of course, it allows you to build all kinds of databases and data sets. A lot of companies are converging all their kind of intranets and documentation results and whatnot here because you can create completely freely all kinds of tagging systems, etc. But of course, Airtable also has this functionality. But I don't know anyone who uses Airtable for note-taking. That's the nice thing about Notion is that it has a gazillion potential possibilities of what it can do, but it doesn't try to force you into it. You can really just use it as a replacement, for example, for Evernote, which is how I got into it, and then slowly discover like, oh, I can do all these other things. And so two more categories, user research and design systems. In user research, in the design tools survey, Useberry really came out on top strong. I think the reason is because it is so robust, not only in the insights, but it allows you to use native apps, websites, as well as Figma prototypes, and I think Adobe XD prototypes as well, to do testing even before launching and then getting insights after you've launched. So a really cohesive and diverse set of tools from this service. Maze is kind of like Useberry, but only for more the prototype side. So we've used this to kind of like test small portions of our prototypes for our services. I wouldn't use this as a one-stop usability research resource because you're not going to be there interviewing the people. You can ask questions from them like a type form type of thing, but ultimately they're going to be on their own. So they might really get frustrated if they don't know how to use it or if your prototype is really confusing. So know that if you're just going to send stuff out into the world without properly thinking about it, you might decrease people's experience of the entire brand. So be mindful with these. And so the real user research, for this, we're getting more and more of these kind of like one-stop shop solutions like Avrio and UserZoom, where you not only can do participant searching, research design, you can then do the research, have it automatically dictate what they're saying. You can create tags, assign them to different portions, and then have like a research repository that you and your team can use for insights. So really amazing, powerful potential that these types of services can offer. So I really recommend checking these out, and I think UserZoom is the more popular of these two. And so design systems, we've talked, or I've mentioned about this bringing design and development closer together, and of course using tools like Webflow and Framer can really help, but of course the reality is that most of our work now still, we have Figma and we have the code, and so we really need to align them. And the more you have platforms where you work, if you have social media and you have like white papers that you're doing and presentations and maybe video content, social media and all of this, it's good to save as much time as possible and to make them as unified as possible. And that's where the power and potential of design systems really come. And I was just laughing about this today, that like if you ask 9 people for a definition of a design system, you'll have 10 answers. And it really is a bit of a wild west, but I would say that a design system is when you have something that lives in at least 2 contexts. You know, so if you have stuff in Figma and it has no parallel to what you're actually shipping, you have a component library and you have what lives in the code, but they're not speaking the same language. So you really have to try to align them as much as possible, and this is where design ops comes into, because it's really, you have to approach it as a team. You can't just be dictating like, here are the things, go and use them, but you have to actually involve the people so that it can actually be valuable. And so, all right, so Storybook is maybe like one of the first design system repository services. It runs locally, requires developers to be involved from the very beginning. Then you have services like Zeroheight, which is kind of like Storybook, but in the cloud with a bit more functionality for commenting and collaboration. And then we have stuff like Supernova, which is really interesting. It's like a design system as a service platform where you kind of have a certain starting point, and then you go and you customize it with your team to serve your purposes. And I think in the same fashion, we have SystemFlow, which is quite interesting, where it gives you a design system starting point that is not only in Figma, but also in Webflow. So you kind of you start with a unified user interface library and a code library, and then it's up to you to keep them aligned, which is, of course, a much better starting point than many projects have today, where you're just taking Bootstrap or whatever and running with it. And we have innovation also in other areas like Linear and Asana for task management. We're kind of getting sick and tired of Jira also swallowing Trello and other services, and really just trying to spend less time looking at tickets and more time doing things. And these types of services really help make these things go faster. And so what does the future hold? Well, I'd say that machine learning and AI have already come into our UI UX world, and for the better. I use, for example, Remove BG as a plugin in Figma almost on the daily. It's just so quick and easy to remove a background. I don't have to open Photoshop anymore, thank God. And we also have stuff like this, Attention Insight, which is machine learning algorithms that will show you heat maps of how people will interact with your service before you launch it. And so this can give you really good insights into where people's attention will go to, what kind of elements they'll be clicking on before you actually put it in front of a user. So kind of like next level heuristics in order to do some self-evaluating. And so again, important to note when we're talking about AI, ML or machine learning, we're just using training data to create a model, which we then use to create predictions and then create them to be more accurate with what we're looking for. And so ideally, I think where we're going to get to is we go more away from social media and these types of services using it to improve their algorithms, more into what we saw, for example, some years ago with Airbnb, that built the system where you can show it these wireframes and it'll build a code-ready interface. And so this is like what they showed before, and now it's actually even a service called UiZard or UZard. You can kind of decide for yourself how you pronounce it, but basically this, you don't even have to have your own set, because with Airbnb, of course, they had their design system and very strict library and shapes, but this kind of is more freeform where you show it your design and then it'll spit out a layout that matches. I think I just took a screenshot of this when it switched, because these definitely don't look alike. But in the future, I've already seen some Twitter threads of people kind of trying this out with what's it called, the GPL3? Anyway, the new text parsing machine learning algorithm. And so ideally, I think in the future, this is going to save time. It's not going to remove our jobs as designers, but it's going to empower us. So instead of, kind of like the telephone, it didn't remove the need to call people to figure out information, it just made it easier. The same way I think machine learning algorithms will help us iterate on our designs much faster, where we can give it a prompt and it'll give us many variations, and then we select the ones that we feel most match what we're going for, and then it'll help us create even more variations of that. But it really is not there to remove the human aspect, because ultimately we're humans creating services for humans, and I really don't see a future where an AI can just take all of that into consideration. And I think also it's good to note that, like, whenever we say something is AI, like facial recognition, the moment we do it, it's machine learning and it's no longer AI. So I think, like, sometimes there's a bit like woo surrounding this, but it's ultimately us just making recursive algorithms that can help us create predictable outcomes. And so some of the illustrations in my performance or this presentation might have looked a bit weird, and that's because I've been using Dream Studio for it. Some of them look really cool, some of them are really friggin' weird like this. They kind of create a bit of like a huh. But I think that these are the type of things that we're going to see more of in the future, for better and for worse. And of course, there's the VR, AR aspect that's going to come at some point. I think maybe the closest thing that we have to think what kind of interfaces we're going to be looking at is maybe the dynamic island with this new iPhone, where kind of the information comes into your context when needed and otherwise disappears into the background. I think there's maybe some interesting things behind this that don't just relate to this context, but time will tell. And I think, yeah, collaboration is so important. So like Around, for example, is a kind of like a Zoom or a Skype, but instead of having this window somewhere, you actually have these floating heads that work with you in your context, which of course, again, removes a lot of friction and brings people closer together doing the work that matters. And I feel like every week now, there's a new whiteboarding solution. Like Zoom came out with their own one. Apple is apparently coming out with their own one. And I think that this just points in the direction that we really are seeing the value in getting people into a shared canvas and working together and centralizing the information, whether or not it's for continual work or just to do it for a workshop and then take the results and go into another context. But collaboration, real time, is more and more, I think, going to be a theme. And yeah, things are going to get even more complicated. There's only more devices that are going to come in and more things that affect the customer experience. So it's going to become even more important to lay out our service blueprints, to understand what is the goal, what is the thing that we're aiming for. And this will help us stay aligned and to make smart decisions where we're trying to figure out, when someone's looking for directions to their nearest cafe, what should we do in our app to make that as straightforward as possible. And so big data, user research, this is going to be even more important. The data can tell us what, but it's only people who can tell us why. You might have heard the $1 million button anecdote of Amazon, where they noticed that when people should be going to checkout, a lot of people were dropping out. They didn't know why, but the data told them that this is a very, the kind of proceed to checkout button was the critical point. And then they talked to people and they realized that it seemed pretty final and very like that I have to make a decision to go to checkout. So they, instead of saying proceed to checkout, it just said continue. And they saw millions more in revenue in the first month of implementing this. So sometimes the insights can create a change that is not so huge, but it has huge effects. And so, yeah, a lot of workshopping, a lot of working together. Here's a few snippets of some projects we've been working on, right? So we can all visualize how the prototype is going to work. We're commenting where the prototype needs to be improved before we put it to user testing, and it's all happening within the context of the service we're then going to show people. So, in conclusion, I think this UX Collective State of UX in 2022 had some really interesting insights. So last year, almost 500,000 new UX designers emerged from the Google's User Experience Design Certificate alone. $15 common starting price for UX gigs on Fiverr. Over 900 people joining LinkedIn every day into the UX group. And almost 300% increase in UX roles according to Hired.com since 2020. So a burgeoning, huge market, but we need to be wary because methods are just methods and they can be used for evil and for stupidity. So, let's bring intelligence. Let's be the people who advocate for the user and who try to link business needs with people's realities. Because this will forever be a chasm. But I really believe that design is what helps bring these closer together. And if we look at history, it's usually design which has brought these things closer together. And again, go towards meaning, for that is what the glue that will help us get to where we are going. And so I say that the future belongs to those who collaborate, iterate, and focus on the intersection between business and customer needs. I think as designers, we've won our seat at the table, but now we really need to facilitate and help achieve things that were previously unachievable. And so if you're interested, we got some courses. If you want to collaborate, just send us an email. Thank you. So let's open the floor to some questions. Anyone? Sibo.
Yes. Hey. So earlier in the presentation, actually, first thank you for it because excellent. I can't find anything that I disagree with.
Damn it.
And been thinking a lot of these things myself as well, and really thanks for advocating for the very user-centric approach, which brings me to the question. So you mentioned that customers are more and more even demanding the more user-centric approach, and they want you to do the user research. But we both work in consultancy, so you most likely have the customers who, in their board, they've had this idea, and they just come to you and, hey, build it. That you coded before, you know how to do this, just build it. Yeah. So how do you help these customers grow the patience for the user research phase? Because I feel that they are very much out of their comfort zone and unwilling to put the investment in the user research. Even as you said, it's you actually lower the risks and save, but in my experience, it's more often than not falls to deaf ears. But what is your experience on this, convincing the clients on the user-centric approach and more user research?
Yeah, it's an excellent question and definitely a very pertinent one. It just reminds me of this saying that I spend an hour each day meditating in the forest, except when I'm busy, then I spend 2 hours. And I think that you have to speak their language. You can't just come there and being like, but users want this, or this is important, or even talk about how another business did it. You have to ask them pretty much point blank in their language, are you willing to sink $500,000 in half a year into something that won't work? Are you willing to maybe tarnish your reputation? We have stories almost every day of these different services where they spent so many millions and they launch it and people are frustrated using them. And sometimes we have in Finland is apotti, you're stuck with it, people are quitting. Doctors are saying, I refuse to work in my profession anymore because this service is so bad. So it's really about making it clear that there is no kind of safe bet that yes, we could just go and do this. And first, usually I say if you want that, you just go to someone else. And it's also like the cycle. You have to say no to some people in order to get the people you want to get. And because it's kind of like saying, would you be ready to, I'll give you $1 million for a race. And you're like, awesome. It's like, okay, you have a minute to get from here to Oulu. And then you're like, that's impossible. And there are really sometimes impossible starting points. And I think that as designers and consultants, the more experience we get, the more we're able to identify these things. And I really think that it's good to also ask, why did you come to me? If you're just going to tell me how to do it, then what am I needed for? And so I think that to have these difficult conversations where you really try to drill down into the root causes and the reasoning behind these decisions, you will uncover the answers that will help you create convincing arguments. But you have to speak in the language of business. You can't speak the language of purely design or human needs. You have to put euros and resource values on these things in order to throw it at them in a way that makes them see that, like, hey, wait a second, we might be stepping in the completely wrong direction. So if you're not willing to invest 2 weeks, why are you willing to invest half a year of everyone's time? Kind of like the question.
And quite often these sort of clients also have difficulties in communicating their value propositions to the users. So that's usually where the difficulty starts. But yeah, that's usually where I start, is the value proposition discussion, and from there try to take the step back to the user. But yeah, thank you, like very much the similar thoughts as you.
Definitely. Yeah, sometimes it can really be like, why do you need this app? It's like, well, everyone else has an app. It's like, that's not going to really work. So yeah, it's really all about the value in the end. Like if it brings no joy and no value to anybody, why even make it? Like, would you even use this? Sometimes is a question I can ask. Great. Any other questions? Disagreements, comments? Ladova, do we have anything on the internets?
Not at the moment.
All right. Yes.
Hi. I have one question that might not be interesting for everybody, but I'm visiting from the US.
Welcome.
And I'm curious about how, do a lot of places have separate user researchers here, or is it always integrated into, like, let's say the product designer position that you have set up? Or is it both, potentially?
Excellent question. I can't speak on behalf of all organizations. My experience has been that the larger the organization, the more likely they'll have dedicated roles to UX researchers. But in my experience, I've always just been advocating for the guerrilla approach that, like, don't wait, just take something and run with it, because you'll learn on the road through experience. So I think that I've more seen people adopt the researcher role into their current role. And some people have, like, I'd say that if, for example, you're a service designer, there's much more of the research aspect part in your position. But I would say that, yeah, in the majority, it's a part of other hats, so to say.
No, thank you.
And if anyone has any other experience or their views on that, feel free to share. All right, well, hey, thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully we can talk about these themes a little bit, and yeah, welcome. And thankfully the sun is even shining, so thank you all.